Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another session today with SFF2021 Standard Chartered Bank. I'm Jason Ho, your moderator today, for a very relevant topic in lieu of the current COVID climate, where face-to-face interaction with clients are not so conducive anymore. We're talking about e-signatures. I'm joined here today by two experts in this field, Samir Hajanis, Global e-signature practice lead from OneSpan, and Thorsten, CTO, SFF20, who went through a very successful implementation with e-signatures in the bank this year. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Thorsten,
Good morning.
would you like to start off by sharing your experience with the implementation in the bank? How did it go, and how is it so far?
Good, so thanks for joining me, Samir and Jason, for moderating us through this session where we really want to share on what we've been able to do in the last 18 months, I would say, from the start of the pandemic and us fortuitously at the same time having looked at e-signatures and to where we got to today. Bit of context there is that about 18 months ago, maybe a bit earlier, we started looking at e-signatures from a conceptual point of view. An organization the size of SFF20 Standard Chartered Bank, enabled by SFF20 to see how could we bring e-signatures into the business and what would that entail. So about 18 months ago, early 2000s, we started experimenting with e-signatures, certain use cases, certain experimentation with technologies. And by the time that the pandemic really set in, we were somewhat lucky to be in a position to say we've looked at this, we understand some of the constraints and some of the opportunities, and now felt it was really a need to push it all the way through to production. And so, Jason, very much so, the journey was one where we had both the fortunate arrangement of having gotten to know OneSpan, become familiar with their product and its capabilities, but also the support by SFF20 to help the group drive that forward into production. So the journey was an interesting one. It was definitely an accelerated push to production. It was a cloud-first project. It was a single tech stack aiming at a global rollout. And so what we felt is, as a small kind of team in 2020, almost in a bit of a skunkworks effort, but with good support from the group, good collaboration, good exchanges, we were able to both bring the technology into production, but at the same time establish a governance framework, kind of a controlled process through which we would be onboarding those use cases. And I think all around, I can say, looking back 18 months later, is that we've had quite a phenomenal success in this short period of time.
Right. So based on your experience, what would you say are the challenges that are slowing down the wider adoption across the bank? I see that you laid a foundation, right? And what would be your advice to someone who's starting on a similar journey?
Right. If we talk about challenges here, I think it's more about the organizational transformation, getting to understand how does e-signatures fit into a business process. It wouldn't be really the technology side. I would say technology's been around for good over 10, maybe close to 15 years since the early days of experimenting with electronic signatures. But with the technology comes a change in the business, right? How does the business process adapt? And if I talk business process, not purely the aspect of sending out a document, right? That is fairly easy. It is aligning the front to back, right? What we now see is new questions arising, right? How do we verify these signatures? How do we kind of assure ourselves that the counterparty that signed the document truly was authorized to sign the document? It's a question of perhaps the entitlement, right? In terms of perhaps certain transactions or certain thresholds that the clients are allowed to sign for certain type of transactions, but not for other type of transactions. So those, I think, is where the bulk of the work lies. Now, I think what we've been able to do is through a process, through a kind of entitlement process, together with legal, together with fraud, together with compliance, is really assess in which jurisdictions can eSign work. It is not a blanket kind of global sign-off for adoption in every country. Secondly, what is the legal enforceability of that signed document in that jurisdiction? And then thirdly is, how do we then align the process so that we both have the assurance and kind of a balanced approach on really evaluating the risk of that document to the value of the transaction or the severity of that contractual obligation. And I think that's gotten us through the journey to where we are today. Mm-hmm. And looking forward to where we've come, I think that that foundation that we've laid, as you mentioned it, Jason, is now scalable, that we can say we've successfully rolled out 40 departments. We're doing thousands of transactions every month through the e-signature platform. And now it's more of a question of further embedding that in more of these digitization efforts, if that gives context.
Samir, how's your experience with your other clients on that front? How are they doing?
Yeah, I mean, very similar. Well, first of all, let me just say that what Thorsten and team have achieved at SCB is phenomenal, in terms of the depth of the penetration across, various lines of business, across countries, geographies. I mean, the challenge that a bank like SCB, or, the way you operate globally poses some unique kind of challenges to innovators. And to achieve that type of penetration today across that is something which is, really challenging. And I see this kind of thing come up fairly consistently across banks, across the financial industry today, where people are looking at cross-border kind of trades happening, transactions which are hosted in one place being signed somewhere else. Those are extremely challenging, decisions that you need to kind of operate within and make sure that you work within the regulatory framework. One thing which I usually find when I talk to our customers, and one thing which I've observed, is where customers have had the foresight of the vision to solve the problem in the context of like a shared service or a center of excellence, like the one which SCB put together here. That is, I've seen that provide a platform for reducing or lowering the barriers of entry for new businesses. So usually, I mean, and I think Thorsten did allude to that, but just kind of from my perspective, that is a combination of a framework, so there's a technology aspect, there's a people aspect, there's a process aspect, right? So on the technology side, that framework which wraps together the core product services, that vendors like us provide, whether it's the document composition, the notifications that you do to your customers, the verification of a signer identity which comes in, to bring the trust in the transaction, the signing process itself, the modality of signing that you would want to use, the storage of the content which gets signed later and is going in your system of record. All of this is encapsulated in this framework, like the way I think Thorsten used the word tech stack. But that tech stack that you build, once you build that out, then every line of business doesn't need to really reinvent the wheel, so to say. So if this stack is put together, it's making it much easier as people want to adopt this. But it's not just about technology. It's also working with your legal, working with your compliance folks in terms of the governance that is required by geographies, the governance that's required by the business, and the regulations that apply to that particular business. What I mean by that is mortgage might have different regulatory needs as compared to wealth management or investment advisory services. So bringing that framework together, which is why I look at it always as a people, process, and kind of product kind of a combination which comes together, that's really what drives. And what we, as from a OneSpan perspective, what we provide is our OneSpan Sign product, which is feature rich and all exposed to our API, so that people can actually build these things and kind of cater to a wide variety of use cases. When you look at a bank of your size, it's actually, you look at this, you see use cases varying from different components, and that is B2C, there's B2B type of use cases, all requiring different modalities of authentication, verification that comes in. And I think all of this, is important to consider when you start looking at rolling out. Obviously, there's the adoption piece which kicks in. I've seen companies which have white label solutions have been able to drive adoption much better. One is because, when you look at this, a consumer interacting with the bank has trust and faith in the brand with the bank itself, right? So SCB's brand needs to be at the forefront to kind of drive that trust, drive that adoption, comfort level, especially with any new digitization workflows, getting people comfortable to kind of accept it, adopt it. And once you have that, you're going to see a hockey stick like a point of inflection. So, and this I've seen with many customers go through this. Probably COVID must have accelerated that, as Thorsten was saying in your case, but very similar stories.
And actually, Samir, to add on that, I think what you've rightly highlighted is the challenge of making this a organizational-wide platform, right? So as opposed to simply a business unit or someone in a silo adopting an e-signature platform, even be it signing up to some SaaS provider or cloud provider, here really coming in and saying, how do we make this an enterprise-wide platform, right? That means scalable, that means centralized, that means a shared service. The only difference here, as opposed to many other general technology infrastructure that's being run by organizations internally, is that this is client-facing. Now suddenly you are representing the bank, and as you mentioned, it is the branding, it is the white labeling, it is the consistency of the client experience, and being able to offer that as a service, I think, is something that Samir rightly highlighted is one of the biggest challenges, and I think we've been able to really navigate that and deliver that as a shared function.
So Thorsten, now that we have laid a foundation, established the framework, so what are some of the upcoming interesting initiatives that that we have in the bank? Are there some new markets or some new technology we're looking at?
Right. Let me take that question as I really start from the point of view of the successes where we've seen the rollout today into 21 countries. We've got regulatory alignment and approval for the rollout into 28 countries. And of course, with us being in almost 60 countries, looking to add that incrementally, it also goes to show that our successes have been in kind of the very well understood use cases. For instance, mortgage repricing. It is a very common activity that you reprice your mortgage, latest interest rates, as they've been trending downwards. And so, of course, in that volume of transactions, it made perfect sense to adopt e-signatures. Looking forward, and what that means is that once a certain market had set precedents for a certain type of transaction, we can easily scale that into more markets. And so the whole business stands to benefit, not just one market. I think secondly, looking at the experience, we've now understood better how we do the document verification, what type of attributes do we look for. But if we think then, what does that mean in the long term? It would mean things such as mechanisms to share entitlement across organizations to sign electronically. What are those mechanisms of sharing that information between organizations, between corporates? I think another aspect that is very interesting is really the long-term document retention. Because today we are now signing documents electronically. Previously they were all filed and kept in cabinets, but today the signature information is embedded inside that document. How do we store that in regulatory alignment or in retention policy compliance for the long term and create those centralized repositories, but not on a department by department basis, but perhaps at an organizational level? I think also additionally, and I'd like to ask Samir next to speak a bit more about that, is things such as how do we do the identification and verification of the individual beyond just the signature, right? I think an important part playing into that is perhaps identity of the individual, right? Who am I and how do I attest that? Is that purely through a 2FA, or is that perhaps an integration into a national identification system? Perhaps extending on that, perhaps to video experiences where I can actually see the client or the counterparty while signing the transaction. So I do think there's quite a rich ecosystem building around the core technology, which is of course the signing of the transaction. And for that we needed a robust technology, which OneSpan has been able to give us, and we've been able to extend on using APIs, using integrations. But I do think that there's a whole ecosystem building out. Maybe I can pass that to Samir.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, if you look at this, where we are reached today is more like an anywhere economy. Consumers, whether they are retail customers, banking customers, whether they are, kind of wealth or private banking, wealth management type of customers, or even lending customers, all of these people are trying to close transactions from where they are, the comfort of their house. People work late hours, extended days. That time people had that I was working downtown and I could just walk to my branch and meet a banker. That's kind of changed now when people are working from home. So being able to actually engage face to face with the banker, with your advisor, has now become a reality. Though I do need, if you look at it today, savings in most of developed countries is at an all-time high. And so this is the right time for actually being able to engage with these consumers and to give them advice of how they could put their money to good use in a way. So all of this, when we look at this and we start looking at in terms of innovation, I think there's a lot of things that's happening. There is, signatures. I think Thorsten said this earlier as well. This has been there for about 10, 15 years today. Getting remote documents signed was always there. You could send someone an email, they click through it, accept it, sign it, and it's done. But as we start evolving, I see two pressures on this market which are driving innovation. One is largely around what's happening from the market itself, which is consumers are wanting to have a more of a human digital kind of experience as such. And if you look at the spectrum of transactions which happen, there are certain transactions which are fairly simple. You can get a document, I sign it, and I walk through it. And then there are, on the other end of the spectrum, there are transactions like mortgage refinancing, or if I'm looking at some kind of loan restructuring that needs to be done, or some advisory services I need, or some account maintenance. These transactions require some type of mediation, some type of assistance by an advisor or a banker or a client-facing resource on these banks. And providing a technology platform which allows us to kind of solve that is really a key aspect of what's driving innovation. And same with us. So we've launched a product which we call OneSpan and Standard virtual room, which kind of brings together a combination of audio, video with assisted screen sharing to kind of bring this to the forefront. So think of it that I'm trying to work on a mortgage refinance or a repricing kind of a contract. My customers at home, but they have a question. They are doing a significant transaction with me, and they have a few questions before they can sign off. It's fairly simple. They message me. I get on a quick screen sharing through this interface of actual document signing. It's actually quite sophisticated. I can authenticate the identity of the person coming into the room, whether it is using two-factor, whether it's using a government-issued ID, or any other modality of authentication, right? A biometrics that you use. Once I get that, and I'm in the signing room, I can do screen sharing. I'm passing control. I could notarize the document. There's a lot more things that you can do, and all of this is kind of done with the underpinnings of evidence which is compiled, which is required from a regulatory and compliance perspective for those requirements. So that's one side of the market that I'm seeing. And then the other side is what Ms. Thorson was talking about, is the shift from most countries, most geographies I see, there's fair amount of regulation and legislation out there which talks about what kind of a verification process needs to happen from a signing perspective. But as that's evolved, I see a lot of countries, and especially advanced economies, moving towards a more national ID or a digital ID type of model. And so we see investments kind of happening on that front, and obviously that's going to be a big combination of what people are going to deliver in the future. I think, and I believe, Thorsten, you were saying you've done some work in that area as well.
Right, and thanks for highlighting it. We are indeed very kind of excited about that space, mostly because, of course, if we look at our footprint as a kind of big network and a footprint, that we are in markets where certain regulations or certain constraints still apply. These might be markets such as Pakistan, Indonesia, certain African markets. And of course, it is there that e-signatures still expect a higher kind of, let's say, level of endorsement or a higher certificate signing standard than just simply drawing a mark on a document. Of course, in Europe, you've got qualified signatures, which are X509 certificate based, and that is a very mature ecosystem. But as we go into the emerging markets, the standards tend to still be very high, but the broader infrastructure is perhaps still emerging. I would say still maturing. Where we're excited is, of course, in markets like Singapore, of course, India, where we're seeing government initiatives to say, well, we want to solve that problem. We have a national identification system, and we are now looking at how do we tie the two together. What that means is that we're saying, how do we then link into those government identification systems and bring in that real kind of second factor authentication, but attested and I would almost say evidenced by a government issued mechanism, right? In India, that is working with Aadhaar. So you could think of the sign experience, to put it in practical terms, somebody receiving a document, wanting to sign it and clicking on a link, then being brought to the eSign Live platform, However, at the same time, triggering an Aadhaar verification, which sends a message to the mobile phone number or any other personal identifiable details, it was through the government system that and cryptographically secured transaction between two parties that is effectively irrefutable. In Singapore, we're working with the sign with SingPass, which is similar. So every citizen and every resident of Singapore has the SingPass application, and so there too you'd be signing and get a push notification on your sign by SingPass, and by confirming that, as well as perhaps a biometric authentication on the mobile phone, we're closing that transaction. So Samir, in the markets that we are looking to expand more into, especially those that are effectively more difficult to master, we have those options. And I think partially we have those options because of your product, and of course the ability of our integrations into those government ecosystems, right? So that opens up opportunities in China and Taiwan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and more of those markets, which I don't think every other product in the market can do. Actually, I would almost hazard to say not that many products in the market can do.
That sounds very exciting. Looks like we have a very interesting journey ahead of us. I think we have a question coming in from the viewers. Do you recommend a hybrid approach for certain processes where face-to-face interaction with the clients is still a preferred approach?
Yes, right.
Yeah.
So perhaps aligned to this topic of accelerating this digitization from paper to online is of course the fact that there are still a lot of real-world interactions, and I think Samir has spoken to some of those online experiences where perhaps there needs to be kind of an assistance or an interactiveness. I do think that plays very much into hybrid. I do think that there's also still an offline element, and that might be the equivalent of meeting your banker or your relationship manager, perhaps in a coffee shop, perhaps in the branch. It might be anywhere. But him being able, or her being able to bring a tablet, being able to also facilitate the transaction and the signing in person. And so, if your client has a certain question, asks her for clarification, goes through a process, but then being able to facilitate a hybrid type experience, I do think that is also still very much necessary, and we can't rule that out. We can't simply say, because we now have digital, or call it electronic signing, that we no longer support any of the offline processes.
Thank you. Another question.
Just to add a point there, Jason, I think one thing I also see is that there is a need to kind of carry or provide portability across these channels. So you can't be siloed into I'm either in a face-to-face or I'm in a digital channel. It is floating, and the transaction could port in any of these channels that happen, right? Whether it's hybrid, whether it's going pure directly face-to-face or even remote. So having one solution which can port across, or you can step and jump into different things depending on the kind of questions you have, that's a very key consideration in my mind as you solve the problem for the future.
Right.
Thank you. Another interesting question is about signers' entitlement. So I guess in especially in the corporate world, board resolutions can be very, very catered to those kind of mandates. Do you have a solution like an integration with an identity management system, Samir?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think the key aspect, what I see with most enterprise deployments, is to not look at a product in a silo. Banks like yourself and even others, your peers, have spent millions of dollars in creating these kind of identity and entitlement platforms, whether it's a system of storage of records kind of platform. And being able to plug into those and carry those things in terms of entitlements across and apply them to any process downstream is critical. So our philosophy has been, rather than reinventing this in each of our products, we actually plug into the bank's infrastructure and be able to carry that through in a seamless process. And so anything that's built within that is consistently applied, whether it's an e-signing transaction or anything going to just your document management platforms, all of them get applied with the same consistency.
All right. Okay, thank you so much, Samir, Thorsten, for your time today. I hope our viewers will have a better understanding of e-signature and its capabilities. With that, I shall leave you with a short video about a very, very interesting upcoming feature from OneSpan. Thank you, everyone. Please enjoy the video and the rest of the festival.
Thank you, Jason and Samir.
Thanks. Thank you.
In today's remote world, human interactions. Before signing complex and high-value agreements within banking, finance, and insurance, customers often turn to channels where they can get human help. That's why we built OneSpan Sign Virtual Room, a secure digital solution that helps organizations guide customers through multi-step financial agreements, signature, web-enabled video conferencing, and rich collaboration features. OneSpan Sign Virtual Room helps organizations engage and transact with customers with confidence. Virtual Room can be used for multiple high-value customer agreements, including account opening and maintenance, wealth management, insurance policies and claims, and car financing. OneSpan Sign Virtual Room helps organizations bring the human element to remote agreement processes. The solution enables organizations to capture legally binding e-signatures in real time, transact with signers remotely, verify the identities of participants, simultaneously review documents and address questions, capture vendor-independent audit trails, and record the signing session. Organizations can also fully white-label the eSign process to keep the spotlight on their brand from start to finish. As a leader in securing customer experiences, OneSpan solution also includes bank-grade security, OneSpan Sign Virtual environment. Customers get the financial help they need in real time from the convenience of their home or office, and organizations get access to a new high-touch channel to help drive growth and improve customer retention. Recreate the power of a face-to-face meeting with OneSpan Sign Virtual Room.